Here we're going to use Excel to calculate the mean of a frequency distribution as well as the standard deviation of a frequency distribution. And part of this will include bits about how to work with Excel. So this is the file on the drive-through data, and what I've done is I've created a new tab where I've input the frequency distribution. Now, I listed the lower limit and the upper limit of each class in different columns so that I can access each number separately in order to do calculations. Of course, we could do the calculations by hand and type the numbers in, but that kind of defeats the purpose. So we've got the lower limits, the upper limits, and the frequencies. Now, the first thing we're going to need to do here is to figure out the class midpoint. Whether we're doing the mean or the standard deviation, we need the class midpoint in order to proceed. So we can put that column anywhere, but in keeping with what I've done in the videos where I've written on the whiteboard, I'm going to put the midpoint column in between the class limits and the frequency. So you can input columns or rows by highlighting it, right-clicking on it, and going to insert. That will shift everything over and give you a new blank column here. I'm going to call this column midpoint X. So this should also have an F in it. Now, you can resize columns or rows, by the way. Like in this case, now that I added the F there, this is having a hard time fitting into the box. So I'm going to go up on this border between columns D and E and right-click or double-click on it, and it will automatically stretch the column to be wide enough to accommodate the words that I typed there. So another trick about Excel, you can click and drag, or you can just double-click and it will automatically resize the column or the row. Now, for the midpoints. The midpoint of any class is found by adding the upper limit and lower limit and then dividing by 2. Now, I suppose I could type in a formula that uses those actual numbers, but I can also reference the cell and have Excel pull the number out of the cell for me. So every column is labeled with a letter, every row with a number. So it's like a coordinate system on a map. This cell here is cell A2. In fact, when I click on it, you'll see that in this box right here, the name box, it calls it cell A2. I can reference that cell at any point in any formula by typing A2. So for example, I would like Excel to calculate the midpoint for me. Anytime you wish to have it do a calculation, you start by typing equals. If you do not type equals, nothing will be calculated. So what I want Excel to do now is take the value that's in the cell A2 for the lower limit. So I'm going to type A2. You notice when I do that, A2 is color-coded in blue, and the cell it's referencing is also color-coded in blue. Alternatively, I can just click on cell A2 when I need it in my formula. I'll show you that in the next thing. Now, I also need to add to that the upper limit, which is in cell B2. So I can type B2 or I can click on it. Note that it is color-coded with a different color. This is to indicate that it is a separate reference. Now, I need to divide that by 2, that sum. But that means that I need the sum to happen first. So just like on a calculator, you can have that happen by using parentheses around the sum so that it makes sure that that addition happens before any other operations. And then I divide by 2. So the value that's in cell A2 plus the value that's in cell B2, add them together first, then divide by 2. And there's the midpoint, just like you would have seen in the video where I wrote on the whiteboard. Now, we can repeat this procedure for the midpoint of the next class, and so on and so forth. But here's where cell references get very useful. Cell references can update automatically if you copy and paste the formula into a new location. For example, if I copy this cell and then I paste it one row down, it will automatically update the cell references and shift them one row down. Note here that the formula in cell C3 no longer references A2 and B2, it references A3 and B3. So it automatically updated the cell references to go down a row because I copied and pasted down one row. Now, I suppose we could continue to copy and paste, but here's another interesting feature. Spreadsheets are designed to work exactly for this kind of thing, where we have a table with similar calculations being done. So here's another interesting thing I can do. When I select any cell, in the bottom right is a little square. If I put the mouse over it, click and drag downward, or in other cases to the side, Excel will automatically copy and paste the formula from the cell that I originally started with into all the cells I've highlighted, and it will automatically adjust the formula for each new row. So you only have to type the midpoint calculation once, and then by copying and pasting or by dragging this little square downward, it automatically, note the formula up here, it automatically copies and pastes the formula and updates the formula, the cell references in the formula, accordingly. An incredibly useful tool. We will use that repeatedly throughout this exercise here, because the next step of finding the mean is to take the midpoint and multiply by the frequency of that class. So once again, we're going to have Excel perform a calculation, meaning we're going to type the equal sign. And what we want it to do is take the midpoint, x, times the frequency, f, and we want it to do this for each of the classes. So let's start with the first class. And again, rather than type this over and over, or rather than copy and paste it one at a time, we grab this little box in the lower right corner and drag downward, and it will automatically update it for us. In this, it's C3 times D3, C4 times D4, C5 times D5, etc. Okay. Now, if we were doing this on the board or on paper, we would now have a total row. Now, just because we don't have dark lines separating each column and row, we just have the faint grid lines here, I'm going to put in one extra little bit of space here. Now, to calculate the sum, I suppose what we could do is one cell at a time is click on it and then plus, click on it and then plus, etc. But Excel has a number of built-in functions. One of them is to add up a series of values by cell reference. The command is sum. Now, in the newer versions of Excel, when you start typing a command after the equal sign, you'll see a number of different possible things show up that you could click on. If it's, you know, a longer command, it'll save you some time typing. Even I don't know what some of these do, so I wouldn't worry about it too much if I were you. We're using very basic commands here. So, we use the sum command, just sum. And we use a set of parentheses. Now we have to tell Excel which cells we want actually added together. We want all of them in this grouping here. So what I'm actually going to do is click and drag to highlight that entire column of numbers, not the XF at the top, just the numbers. You'll notice here that it is using cell references, but it's got a colon in between it. That is used to describe an array of values in contiguous cells, meaning that all the cells are directly touching each other in a rectangle. It can be multiple columns or multiple rows or both if need be. But it is simply a range of cells, all of which are next to each other and all of which are to be involved in the calculation. Lastly, we close off the parenthesis when we're done telling it what to add, and then hit enter. And there is the sum of the x times f's. Now we're not quite done yet. We do need one other thing here. We need the sum of the frequencies so that we can divide by it to get the mean. So here's an interesting thing. Once again, we can use the fact that Excel understands cell references and updates them automatically when something is copied and pasted to copy this cell and paste it here. When we paste it one column to the left, the cell references will automatically update to move one column to the left. And what we have here is the sum of the frequency column. Look at the formula. The formula is the sum of the range of cells D2 to D7, automatically updated, shifted over to the left because we pasted one cell over to the left. Now we do have one last calculation to perform, and that is that we need to take the sum of the XFs and divide it by the frequency, the sum of the frequencies, the sample size. So I will do one more equals this cell for the sum of the x times f divided by this cell for the sum of the frequencies. And that is our grouped mean. So the cell references in Excel are incredibly useful, incredibly powerful. They allow us to only have to type a formula once and then instantly copy it or paste it into other cells and have the formula automatically updated. Incredibly useful if you know how to use it. Okay, that's the mean. The standard deviation involves a little bit more calculation, but the basic idea is the same. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to copy and paste this table into another location so that we can use all of it again. Now, again, remember the midpoints were done with cell references, but those cell references were relative to the other cells in this grouping. That is to say, this 101.5 is referencing the two cells to the left of it. So when I copy and paste, the new formula is still going to reference the two cells to the left of it. Excel automatically updates the cell references to account for the new location. Now in this case, we don't need an x times f column, but we do need a deviation. So Excel is not going to nicely type x bar here, so I'm just going to type x minus the mean. Now, what we need here is the midpoint for our x value minus the mean. Now, I suppose we could type in the mean. It is a constant value, but we can also use the reference to the cell above where we calculated it. Now, in the example that we used in the other video on the whiteboard, I used 160. I used the rounded mean. And part of that is because it helps with keeping the calculations somewhat more manageable. But if we have the opportunity to use technology here, then we should use the grouped mean without rounding. We should never round until we're all the way done with our calculations if we can avoid it. So, while it's not negative 58.5, it is negative 58.52, which is pretty close. Excuse me, I would like to make them centered. Now, here's an interesting thing. Suppose I copy and paste into a new cell. That doesn't seem right. In fact, if you go back to the video that we had, that's not the deviation of 139.5 at all. In fact, it should be still negative. 139.5 is still below the mean. And this isn't negative. In fact, it's exactly the same as the value that's there. Well, why is that? Well, let's go back and look at the formulas here. In this cell, we typed in C16 minus E11. So when we copied and pasted the formula down a cell, it did shift down here, but it also shifted down here. We'd like it to still be referencing this single cell, no matter where we copy and paste this formula to. We'd like it to still be referencing that cell. So when while we do want the midpoint cell reference to shift down, we want this one to stay where it is all the time. How do we do that? I'm going to come back here for a moment to this first one that we typed in correctly. Now, the reason Excel is updating the references when we copy and paste is because these are what is called relative references. It is referencing that C16 is a cell 2 columns to the left, but in the same row as where we are typing the formula. So when we copy and paste the formula, wherever we paste it, it will always reference 2 cells to the left. E11, same thing, is right now referencing 5, same column, but 5 cells up. So if I copy and paste it here, it will still reference 5 cells up. We would like it to always be referencing this cell without ever changing it. And the way we do that is we put a $sign in front of the E and in front of the 11. This fixes the E so that it will no longer change columns when we copy and paste the formula. And this fixes the 11 so that it no longer changes row when we copy and paste the formula. So a $sign in front of the column and a $sign in front of the row will let Excel know that that formula is to stay fixed, even when we copy and paste. So let's try it now. Much better. Note the formula here. The midpoint reference was indeed updated, but the reference to the grouped mean stayed where it was, even though we copied and pasted downward. And when we drag downward, it will automatically fill in the others, always updating the midpoint reference and always leaving the grouped mean exactly where it is. So, absolute references versus relative references. Very important distinction. Now, the next part is to square that deviation. Well, again, very simple. We do the formula equals the value here, just to the left of it, squared. The exponent caret is above the number 6 on the keyboard. Alternatively, what you could do is simply type E16 times E16. That value times itself. Either way, it will do the correct calculation. And we drag downward. All of these numbers, by the way, you can verify with the video where we did it on the whiteboard. They are going to be slightly off because we're using 160.02 here as opposed to 160 like we did on the whiteboard, but the values should all be very, very close. Now, one more. We need the squared deviation times the frequency. So, again, a calculation with the equal sign. The squared deviation times the frequency. Drag it down. Okay, just about ready to do our final calculation here, but like before, we do need the sum of this column. So equals sum, highlight the values, the cells you wanted to add, close the parentheses, and equals. Now, I'm going to widen this column a little bit because if you notice, there are actually more decimal places to each of these than we may have realized at first. But the narrow width of the cell did not allow them to be displayed. In fact, the same is true for the squared deviation. So I'm going to double click up here to widen that column so we can see all of the decimal places. So this is now the sum of the squared deviations times their frequencies. We also are going to need the sample size. Well, fortunately, we already have that up here. So I'll just reference that cell again. So we start with the grouped variance, which is the squared deviations times their frequencies divided by the total sample size but minus 1. So I want that subtraction to happen before my division. So I'm going to type a set of parentheses, reference the cell with the frequency, or with the sum of the frequencies, the sample size, and subtract 1 from it. Now, this is not the end of our calculation. This is the variance. We'd go one more step, and that is to take the square root of the variance. To do a square root, if you start typing square root, SQ, you'll see that it gives you a few different options here, but we want just the basic square root of a number. So we finish typing it, and then tell it what we want the square root of. Now, interestingly enough, when we used a group mean of 160.02 as opposed to on the whiteboard where we just used 160, we actually got very, very, very much the same value. In fact, it will round to 49.9 exactly as it did when we did it on the whiteboard. So, Excel is a very powerful tool if you've got it. Now, this data file happens to have the raw data, so I'm going to come down here and click over to the raw data. here's the original 50 data values that went into the frequency distribution. So I'm now going to come over here just to any old cell, it doesn't matter. I'm going to find the raw mean of the data. Now, to do that, I suppose what we could do is have Excel add all of it up and then divide by the number of values that there are, but Excel actually has an average command built into it. And like the sum command, all you have to do is highlight the cells and close the parentheses and hit enter. And there it is. Nice and quick and easy. So again, if you have access to the raw data values, this is a great way to get them. Nice and quick and easy. If you don't, if all you have is the frequency distribution, then you do what we did on the other tab. Now, Excel can also calculate the standard deviation. Now here we have to be careful. There is a slight difference in the formula for the standard deviation of an entire population as opposed to the standard deviation from a sample. So we need to be very careful here and type in stdev.s. Once again though, we highlight the data values, close the parentheses and hit enter. So what we see here is that the mean of the raw data is very, very close to the mean of the grouped data, or I should say the other way around. The mean of the grouped data, while not perfect, is very, very close. 160.02 versus 160.24. The standard deviation of the raw data and the standard deviation of the group data are also very, very close. The grouped data was 49.9, whereas this would be 49.1 after rounding. Very, very close. Close enough that when we don't have access to the raw data, we can trust that the frequency distribution is going to give us a very decent estimate of these values. So Excel is a very powerful tool if you have it. You should have access to it through Office 365. But if you are using a Mac or an iPad or something like that, then you may have other technology or other spreadsheet tools that you wish to use. And while many of the commands and the workings of them are very similar, they're not all exactly the same. But Excel is the one that I know best and use the most often, and if we were meeting on campus, it's the one I would be teaching you to use in the classroom. That being said, I will have videos up also for using the Numbers app on an iPad as well as the TI-84 calculator. If there are other programs out there that you are using that you have access to, please let me know. I will take a look at them and help you out as I can, but Excel and Numbers on a Mac or iPad are definitely the most common. And of course, if you have the TI-83 or TI-84 calculator, that works very well also, with the exception of having to type all the values in, which is kind of annoying. But you can check out those videos on the other applications to see how they work.